Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Christina, good evening.
Good evening, Melissa. Good evening, everybody.
So, this is quite a feat. We are here at I Want to Be Wonderful. I think that we all do. What an apropos name for a show, especially for someone of your caliber. So let me start off with this first and just get this out the way. I have known Christina for many years, and I've been so proud of her trajectory and her growth and her personal leadership, deciding what she wants to do with her career and taking that step to move towards it. I know for me personally, I've always had issues, especially as a young woman, dealing with imposter syndrome and can I actually do this? And there are other people who are better than me, and I've made mistakes, so that doesn't mean that I'm good enough where I can do this. And it took me a lot of years to get through that. So I admire when I see young people, especially, who are able to just jump over that hurdle and create the life that they want. And I think that that's something that we should all, take note of. It doesn't matter how old we are. It doesn't matter where we are in our careers, what we do, that, at the end of the day, the universe needs you to show up, and that all of that noise in the back of your head, that's just it. It's just noise. And I'm so happy that you were able to take that noise and just shove it to the side and move through. And that's not to say that everything is like all roses, but the fact that you've been able to do what you wanted and you continue to strive to that is admirable. So I'm very proud of you. So I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
But to talk about why you're here, let's talk about how we got here. So you're an artist. Where did that come from? Where did that start?
Well, my family is relatively creative. My dad is a jazz musician, and my grandma, my paternal grandmother, she's a painter and a sculptor. So I was always looking at her work growing up, and I think it really encouraged me to pursue something that I was interested in, which is painting and drawing from a young age. And even though imposter syndrome is a thing, just being able to see role models around you who either they made a life of it or they make room in their life to do it. I think that's really important and encouraging if you're looking at yourself oh, what if this doesn't make sense in the long term, but you just keep doing it and seeing how it goes.
So you grew up in a creative family, and from what I noticed, you grew up in a family that was not only creative, but because they kept their passions alive, they were able to support you in your journey to move into a professional career doing this. Did this include going to school? Did you want to go to school for art, or was your thoughts maybe I'll do accounting and just keep this as a passion project? How did you do this?
Well, I would never study accounting just because I'm not really a math person. But I think my parents were always very encouraging and understanding. And even if they weren't fully aware of how to make a career out of art or painting or whatever, they were willing to listen to me when I explained what I wanted to do. And going to school, I always wanted to study art, but I didn't really want to go to an art school just because I wanted to be around other majors and people studying other things. And actually, I technically minored in communications just because I wanted to do something that was outside of art if I needed to do something else in my career, just in case things don't take off immediately.
Okay. And so I like that. Typically what we've been told is let's take up a minor or a double major just in case this doesn't work out. But there's a key word there, just in case this doesn't take off immediately, which means that you can still continue on, pushing towards your course. But in the meantime, if the rent is due, you can pick up a little side gig and continue to do your work. And I think that's something really important to think about. So this show really talks about your life moving from working, out of a bedroom to now going off into the big wide world and making your dreams come true. Tell us about the show and the idea for it.
So the show as a whole, I would say it kind of started off with where I was when I first met Jill. We worked together at my first solo show at Arts Warehouse.
Okay.
And so just being in that space before I moved to New York, that's kind of where I started showing more after school. And then when we reconnected, we kind of talked about that and how like I left Florida to go to New York. And then, yeah, I moved back this past year. But for the most part, I think it was really about like self discovery, but in the sense of like when you realize like sometimes life is like a certain way and you follow a certain path, and like even if it's like, oh, I'm gonna maybe try to make art happen or make art work, but I'm gonna do accounting or I'm going to work at a museum or I'm gonna be a teacher. And so it's like being honest with yourself and realizing that like this is not what you want to do. And like I was teaching before I moved, and I realized like I wasn't a committed teacher, I wasn't a bad teacher, but it's not what like somebody would want if they wanted a teacher that was like going all in for them and being able to provide what they need. And so I felt like I was doing them a disservice. So I just decided to like not continue teaching that year and to actually move.
Tell me a little bit more about taking up space, by making those decisions and deciding, even if it was a matter of something that I need to do temporarily, you still have to decide that I'm going to take up space in this world doing this. So, what was your process to actually making that happen?
I think I guess I would say when you become aware of like the mark that you're leaving and how other people are interpreting what you're saying. And so in college, I was working on portraits a lot, and most people were like interpreting them as Black people, whether that was true or not. And so I think realizing like the space that you take up, whether you're just like, oh, I'm going to draw this thing, it doesn't really mean anything, but like it means something to someone who's looking at it. So it's like choosing to be intentional in that moment, and then choosing to continue to intentionally take up space for yourself and make like I guess a story that other people can relate to as well.
So, if we don't mind running back to that, so you mentioned your time in college and portraiture and people dealing with what they thought. How did you set your sights on exactly how you would interpret this work for this particular show? Did you want to move into abstract more? Did you want to play with abstract in portraiture and mix it all up? What were you thinking?
I think I was heavily into self portraiture around the time I was into college. In college, and I was doing a lot of like just faces and portraits, and it was probably one of the first pieces that I sold was like a large face. And like at that point in time, there was a gallery that wanted to potentially represent me or work with me, but like I knew I didn't want to get stuck just making faces when I wanted to do more like figurative work and even go the abstract route. So I wanted to like give myself more time to just figure out what comes natural to me. And so usually when I do paint, like it is a more like an underpainting. It's the more abstract approach to anything. And so I felt like I really wanted to explore the natural way I do things rather than having like a set finished product in mind.
And have you found where you want to land? Are you still trying to decide what you would like to explore?
I think I get excited about a lot of different things. And so like my friend says like this show and this body of work is really me just like showing my different abilities and different interests, but I think I do know like where I want to like spend my time at the moment. And I think last year was also very special for me because i I was really just doing small work that allowed me to work very quickly, but then also just like pull out the essential parts of an image and then figure out what I wanted to say, and then like see like step back and see that this is like a consistent visual language that I can continue with. And I think prior to that, I was always kind of dealing with like imposter syndrome or being like hindered by like, oh, what about this person saying this or whatever. And so that's also why I didn't necessarily get my MFA, just because a lot of times you can just end up trapping yourself in what other people are saying about your work.
Gotcha.
And so I like to leave room for exploration in my practice, but I do believe that I found what I want to commit to.
Something else about your practice that, really appeals to me is that you're not just consumed by visual images, you learn from all parts of the world, I feel. And literature has a big part in that. And I know that, like, I talked to you about that a lot, but I just think that it's fascinating. And I think that oftentimes people don't realize that, creativity can be found anywhere, and you can pick this up in any location. So talk to us about literature in your work.
Um, yeah, I love to read, and I love like just learning about history and finding different things that are relevant to today that people have dealt with already. And like for example, this week I just thought about Occam's razor a lot because I was
Okay.
watching some shows where it came up. It's basically like focusing on the simplest path forward rather than making things unnecessarily complicated. And a lot of
Okay.
times that's true in art as well, by just
Right.
like at least with abstraction, just taking a simple approach and like finishing an image that way. And then this body of work for this show was really following the hero's journey in a way.
Okay.
And while it might not be like incredibly literal, just anyone who's really following a non-traditional path is kind of escaping like the standard way of doing something. And so it's kind of like you going off to follow your own journey and to follow your own story. And like you have the ordinary world that you're escaping because you're choosing to do something that other people might not understand or that is inside you first and other people can't see it.
Yes.
And so I really appreciate a lot of Joseph Campbell's his work and just like when things are challenging, like when I moved to New York and I'm just like spending all my time in an empty apartment, just like freelance writing and then painting when I can. And like in a way where it doesn't necessarily make sense to somebody that's like, oh, why don't you have any furniture? Why don't you whatever? And you're like, I'm following this path and
Yes.
I'm going through this thing. And it's like,
Right.
yeah.
Gotcha. Right. So there was an earlier conversation about some of the pieces here, and we talked about your use of materials, and that there's all types of things here. There's bed sheets, found materials. Tell us about where materials land in your work and how that inspires a new piece.
I would say like in college when I was really finding out what materials I really like to use, I would go back to what I used like as a child, so like oil pastel and watercolor, and then acrylic and charcoal. And so just being open to different mediums in that way really allows me to, I guess, become interested in other things I may have used before or may not have used before, like wood. When I was initially doing large portraits, I was working on wood, and I really like the way that it accepts like a variety of materials. And then I think I just get really excited to see what happens with something like, oh, if I leave like this fabric this way, or if I glue something on here like that, and then just being able to kind of find an answer from like these two disparate pieces of material that might not make sense initially, but then it becomes part of the work and then part of the meaning of that work.
Do the materials speak to you? Do they change the final concept? Do you go in and see something and say, I want to use this for this, and then the materials say, no, we want to be molded this way, we want to be used this way?
Sometimes. Oftentimes it's like a conversation. So it's like, if you're going to do this, why don't you do that? And then something like that, or it might change the initial approach. Like in the piece with the curtains, I was debating whether or not to like fully paint the drapes or just leave it like that. It's like I'm not necessarily interested in painting drapes. It's like I could, but do I want to? No. So I'm more interested in just seeing how this other material adds to it and like what happens if I like cut it this way or leave it that way or put it over here and how it affects the rest of the work.
Gotcha. So we're going to take a little virtual tour while we're all sitting down. If you wouldn't mind just giving us kind of a background of each section, starting in the order that you want, about what we should see from this particular exhibition.
Okay. I guess I'll start in the center, which is directly behind all of you over here. So as I mentioned before, I was mostly working on large portraits once I graduated college. And so the piece that's at the far back is really kind of my return to portraiture. And so I probably haven't worked that large in that way before. But I really loved, I guess, my initial like abstract approach, and then going into the figure more with like contouring and just seeing how I guess the figure is emerging from like the energy that the piece has. And a lot of my work right now is usually created in a conversation with like my writing, because I do write a lot. And so that piece in particular was kind of born out of a poem that I wrote after a breakup with somebody. And so it's pretty much about like dealing with these difficult emotions, but like understanding like the power that's found in these emotions, like sadness or anger. And so it's kind of just about realizing like how you take up space in the world and how much power you really have, even if you feel like you don't have it. And the pieces in the center, they're probably my first sculptures that I've exhibited. And they're based on this series that I have called 200 Little Deaths, which is about how the Black femme body is viewed in the world. And so the name comes from the word for orgasm, the French word, which is le petit mort, which is the little death. And so it talks about like the violence and then the pleasure that the Black body is viewed with. And so just because I like experimenting a lot, I do really love the idea of just cutting the figure out of like the paper or the background and seeing like where it goes and how I approach it differently. And I haven't worked on that series in a while because I want to do 200 of them. But the way that it's grown and developed, I really love how it's gone from like just being on the wall to being like in a physical space. And then my next iteration will be like fully 3-dimensional on both sides. And I initially, when I created the series, I really just wanted it to confront the viewer so they can just like look at it in the space without it just being on the wall, and they can like walk around it and really, I guess, feel the presence of those bodies. And usually when I'm working on like cutout figures or just the figure in general, I do try to focus on like a power pose. So like, yeah, like where somebody's like this, or like just like super confident, and something that's easy to relate to and makes you feel a certain way when you look at it. And okay.
And if you can't see what's behind us because there's a wall, but when we go behind the wall and we get a chance to explore what feels very vulnerable and powerful to me, which is another way of taking up space. Can you talk to us about how you explore that part of yourself and find that comfortability with being so open? Talking about 200 little deaths and not being afraid to talk about sexuality or to talk about just breakups in very almost literature backed, powerful, vulnerable ways. That takes a lot out of a person to be able to show that. But how do you do it? What do you draw from?
I guess I definitely look at history and like other women artists that have drawn from their own emotional experiences and their pain, like Kathy Kollwitz, and just really like look into it. And then I think really being in the moment when you're creating also is helpful, and then understanding that like you're not necessarily making this to sell or to show, but it's like really like, this is what I experienced, this is what I went through, and like this helps me feel better, or this is how I like stop thinking about that because I'm able to translate it to this image. And then just like not really thinking about how someone else is going to interpret it, like, oh, like what if my parents feel weird about this or whatever. Right. So just trying to get past that, and then understanding that's really just about, I guess, what you feel on the inside and allowing yourself to feel that.
When you completed the work from this particular exhibition and brought it here, and you were able to put this up, where did you see this work going next? Do you see yourself continuing to explore these themes, or was this your stop and say, the story is complete, it's time for a new story?
I think the story, which is about most of the work behind me, where um, I titled the work Anatomy of an Art Star.
Okay.
That story, I guess, is complete because I did
Okay.
technically move from New York, but I think the essence of the story is always going to like carry on in terms of following like the developmental journey and like becoming a different version of yourself, because I think that continues like throughout your life. And then a lot of the themes that I explored in the work, like through the materials themselves, I really enjoyed that process. So I do see myself taking some of those materials and practices and using that in my new work. But I definitely, yeah, I like the idea of just doing something different and exploring something else, whether it's still like on the emotional plane, it's still communicating something similar, but it also just follows me where I'm going in my life right now.
One of the early conversations that we had with some of the staff here at the museum was really to talk to some of the artists who are here who are looking to start their own careers. Um, and just in having like some casual conversations with some of the artists here, I think what was really important to me is your commitment to craft and your commitment to storytelling. You mentioned that you were a teacher, but you weren't a committed teacher. But we know that we're all teaching. We're teaching all the time. People are always watching us. If you had to speak to a colleague, how would you speak to them about paying attention to storytelling?
I guess I would want to know what their like intentions are with their work and like how they wanted to communicate to their audience. And I think it is hard to take like a look at yourself and realize like what's going on in your life in terms of like patterns.
Mhm.
But I think telling a story really is about finding like the unique thread that everyone experiences in their own life and being able to say like this is what happened in my life, and I know that you've experienced the same and we can talk about it because I'm opening the door by telling you what I've been through.
Gotcha. And one more thing that I know that kind of came up in the conversation too, and kind of an extension of storytelling. So you're talking about telling your own story, but for others who may be, kind of like a fly on the wall looking into the world of someone else or experiencing something that they've never seen, how would you recommend someone actually be able to see what's going on in front of them and work on finding ways to interpret that?
I definitely believe in reading other people's stories and understanding like what they talk about and how they talk about it.
Okay.
And I think storytelling at its core is just sharing like the history of something. So even if it's like a boring story, there's something there. And so once you start with something, you'll end up with something else, and then you continue to refine it. Like even if you're like, oh, like I woke up, I went to the gas station, and I came back. That's still some sort of a story.
Right.
And just following like the general like arc of storytelling, where you have the beginning and like the middle and the end, and you have like a climax. And so just finding something and then like being able to like support it in some way, whether some of it is fictional or it's like a retelling of somebody else's story. I think being able to use your imagination is really a benefit to telling a compelling story.
So, because you are an avid reader, for our audience, can you give us two books that have been really inspirational in your life that you maybe go back to?
Like art books or general
And
books.
yeah, general books, whatever the book that inspires you and inspires your work the most, which may not be an art book.
Hmm. I feel like whenever you ask this question, I just don't know. So, I would say Art and Fear is like a good book in general, where it's talking about imposter syndrome and then it's talking about um, just doing work and like maybe not overthinking it and just creating as much as possible. And then, hmm, I don't know. I read like other books
Right.
where it's just people's notes on painting.
Gotcha.
So I think being able to see somebody else experience what you've experienced, I think that also helps.
So I'll give some of mine. So I'm a huge Zora Neale Hurston fan. Their Eyes Were Watching God was a book that I read in high school. My drama teacher introduced me to that book as a high school student, and it meant the world to me. And I got a chance to perform it because I was in theater. That's actually my background. And I got a chance to perform it in speech and debate. So all of her work has always been inspiring, the way she's told stories, and also just her personal life was always really exciting to me. That she really went throughout her life, living a very artistic life. She lived the life that she talked about. So that was always inspirational to me in everything that I do, because I always think of, when I think of quality and I think of the best of the best, her work always stands out to me as a representation of some of the best literature. And you always want to be like in the number, right? That's something they say in the church, in the number. I want to be in the number. I want to be in the number with her one day. So that's always what inspires me. Film is probably something that you pay attention to than if you like to read.
Yeah.
Am I right about that? So where does film lie in these pieces?
I think I just like approaching a medium like film by understanding like what excites the filmmaker, and like paying attention to like how they communicate something, like, oh, like, do they use this sound to like show that something bad is going to happen, or like maybe the shape that something makes in the background. So I think a lot of times I'm just reading like different quotes of something, or like watching a story, or like a little bit of a movie. So it's like hard for me to pick something out of my mind, but like I really do enjoy anybody that has talked about the Black experience and being a creator and being a woman and being able to say what you want and have other people listen to you.
Gotcha. So before we close out and go to questions, if we can talk a little bit about craft. So we've learned a few years ago that it takes 10,000 hours to master whatever it is that you're trying to master. And whether it's like crochet, baking, writing, 10,000 hours is important. How did you start the process of mastering your craft? So you've done this for a long time. Though you're relatively young, you've put in many hours of work. So how did you master your craft? How did you start? And how do you keep up with that?
I think just being committed is where it begins. Like, even if you don't really see the results that you want, just knowing that you're going to do this today and you're going to keep doing it the next day is helpful. And then also building like a routine. Even if your routine changes throughout your life, just knowing that like today I'm going to do this for 5 hours or 2 hours or 3 hours. And also being able to look at how other people achieve what they achieve. And so a lot of it for me, since I am a freelance writer, I know that looking at entrepreneurs has helped me in my practice, because it's similar. Like when you're starting a startup, you're just working and you're like putting in the sweat equity. And so I think just understanding that work ethic and like learning to put it into your practice, like even if you have like the overwhelming idea that like, oh, this work isn't good, or I suck, or like, you're overthinking it, you're just able to like keep going and keep just doing something. And I think like once you do something repeatedly, like continuously, you're going to find something that's there, and then you'll be able to like hone in on it even more.
Gotcha. So what's next?
Showing at African Art Fair in Opalaka. Alfonso over there is a founder, so you can talk to him more about it if you'd like. But that opens, the VIP opening is on the 30th, and it runs until the 5th during Art Basel. And yeah. And
what is inspiring? Don't tell us where you're going to go, because one might steal it, right? But what is inspiring your next body of work? And you can tell us like one little bit of it so that you don't give it all away.
I guess so. This work was specifically about me. I think being able to have some sort of detachment from the story and the work itself allows me to just do things that maybe I'm not doing if I'm like thinking about myself and what I've been through. And so the body of work that I started last year, where they're like very small pieces, I sort of am making those bigger in a way, but then also being able to tell like a story that involves some of the elements here, like where you
Okay.
see like the landscape and then interiors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Christina, thank you so much for your time.